Department of Education. You might not know this, but if you went to public school in the United States after 1980, you have Jimmy Carter to thank for the Department of Education. Carter believed that education was the foundation of a strong democracy and needed its own federal department. So, in 1979, he signed the bill that created the Department of Education, separating it from the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. This move centralized federal efforts to improve education nationwide, ensuring that generations of students would have access to better resources and opportunities. The Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act. Carter had a soft spot for the great outdoors, and it wasn't just for show. In 1980, he signed the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act, which protected over 157 million acres of land, an area bigger than California. This act created new national parks, wildlife refuges, and wilderness areas, making it one of the most significant conservation efforts in U.S. history. If you've ever visited Denali or hiked in Wrangell St. Elias, you've got Carter to thank for keeping those wild spaces wild. Human rights. Carter didn't just preach about human rights. He made it a cornerstone of his foreign policy. He wasn't afraid to call out dictators and oppressive regimes, even when it wasn't politically convenient. One particular policy of his administration is the Presidential Directive 30, PD 30. Issued in 1977, this directive emphasized the importance of human rights in U.S. foreign policy. It directed U.S. ambassadors and diplomatic missions to monitor and report on human rights conditions in their respective countries, and to factor human rights into their diplomatic efforts, and cut off military aid to countries with poor human rights records and supported dissidents and democratic movements worldwide. Carter's commitment to human rights might not have always made him popular, but it set a moral standard for how the U.S. engages with the world. The Carter Center, established after his presidency, continues to champion human rights, among other global issues, reflecting his ongoing commitment to these principles. Camp David Accords. One of Carter's biggest achievements was brokering peace between Egypt and Israel, two countries that had been at each other's throats for decades. In 1978, Carter brought Egyptian President Anwar Sadat and Israeli Prime Minister Menachem begin to Camp David, where they hashed out what became known as the Camp David Accords. However, the story didn't end there. Just a few years later, in 1981, Sadat was tragically assassinated by extremists in his own country, highlighting the fragile nature of the peace Carter had worked so hard to achieve. Despite the tragedy, the Camp David Accords remain a cornerstone of Carter's legacy. This peace treaty not only earned Carter a Nobel Peace Prize later in life, but also showed the world that even a peanut farmer from Georgia could play a significant role in international diplomacy. Energy crisis. Carter was all about energy conservation, and he wasn't afraid to get cozy in a cardigan to prove it. During the 1970s, the U.S. faced an energy crisis, with skyrocketing oil prices and gas shortages. Carter's response? He encouraged Americans to conserve energy, even famously suggesting they turn down the thermostat and wear sweaters. But it wasn't all talk. Carter also pushed for renewable energy sources, setting the stage for today's clean energy initiatives. He even installed solar panels on the White House, making him the OG environmentalist president. Unfortunately, those panels were later removed by his successor, but the point still stands. Panama Canal treaties. The Panama Canal had been under U.S. control since its completion in 1914, but Carter decided it was time to hand over the keys. In 1977, he signed the Panama Canal treaties, which gradually transferred control of the canal back to Panama by the end of 1999. It was a controversial move at the time. Some people thought Carter was giving away the farm, but it ultimately helped improve U.S.-Latin American relations. Plus, Panama got its canal back, so everyone mostly wins. Iran hostage crisis. Okay, so the Iran hostage crisis wasn't exactly a victory. But hear me out. When 52 Americans were taken hostage at the U.S. Embassy in Tehran in 1979, Carter was thrown into one of the most challenging situations any president could face. Despite immense pressure, he remained calm and worked tirelessly to secure their release. While the crisis dragged on for 444 days and certainly hurt his chances for re-election, Carter's dedication to bringing the hostages home safely is worth acknowledging. And yes, they were finally released on his last day in office. Talk about a bittersweet farewell. Deregulation. Carter wasn't just about government programs and regulations. He also believed in loosening the reins on certain industries to boost competition and lower costs for consumers. During Jimmy Carter's presidency, several key deregulatory measures were implemented to boost competition and efficiency across major industries. The Airline Deregulation Act of 1978 removed federal control over airline fares and routes, leading to more competition and lower prices for consumers. The Motor Carrier Act of 1980 deregulated the trucking industry, reducing government restrictions on rates and routes, while the Staggers Rail Act of 1980 did the same for the railroad industry, allowing for more flexible pricing and operations. These policies were part of Carter's broader efforts to reduce inflation and stimulate economic growth by fostering a more competitive market environment. The SALT II Treaty. In the tense atmosphere of the Cold War, Jimmy Carter worked tirelessly to reduce the risk of nuclear war. One of his most significant efforts was the negotiation of the SALT II Treaty, Strategic Arms Limitation Talks with the Soviet Union. The treaty aimed to limit the number of nuclear weapons that each superpower could have, making the world just a bit safer from total annihilation. Although the treaty was never ratified by the Senate due to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, both countries adhered to its terms for years, and it laid the groundwork for future arms control agreements. Post-presidency. Carter's presidency might have had its ups and downs, but his post-presidency is where he really shined. After leaving office, Carter didn't just retire to a life of leisure. He became a global humanitarian powerhouse. Through the Carter Center, he's worked to eradicate diseases like guinea worm and promote peace and democracy around the world. He's also built homes with Habitat for Humanity, written a bunch of books, and even won a second Nobel Peace Prize in 2002 for his ongoing efforts to better humanity. Not too shabby for a guy who left the White House with a less than stellar approval rating.